Hey, and welcome. Thank you for joining us live. I am very excited to have you with us today. If you haven't seen me yet, I'm Jen Dalton. I'm a personal brand strategist, and I just launched my second book called Listen, and it's all about difficult conversations and why we need to build those skills now because they can make such a difference. And today I'm extremely excited to have a good friend, an amazing leadership and executive coach, Diane Faulk, with me. And we are going to talk about these crazy, difficult conversations leaders have had this year and maybe even what they might be facing next year. So, welcome, Diane. I am thrilled to have you join me. Thank you so much. And not only are you joining me as a guest, but you're also in the book. So, thank you for that too.
You're very welcome. It's so great to be here with you, Jen. I wish we were in the same room, but hey, virtually we're in the same room.
That's right. That's all that matters. As long as we can see each other and speak and listen. Absolutely, 100%.
Well, thanks for having me on. And of course, you know me, not everybody else knows me, but I'm a curious type. So I'm just going to jump right in and ask you, why did you write the book, Jen?
Why did I write that? Why would I write a second book? Didn't I learn the first time?
That's right.
So I'm a big fan of putting what you know or what you figure out on paper. And if you had asked me, I don't know, 3 years ago, 2 years ago, last year, Jen, are you good at communicating? I would say, yeah, I'm pretty good at communicating. Um, but then my husband and I one day were talking about politics, and it turns out I'm not as
Uh-oh.
good as I thought because I kind of lost my cool a little bit, and I was like, wow, that's not like me. We're really not that different in opinion. What's going on here? And so I started to do research. That was right around the 2018 elections. And then I put together a presentation, did some research on the brain, did some research on how can I control my reactions better because I like talking about politics. I wanted to practice. Fast forward to 2019, and in early May, my mother passed away last year.
Hmm.
Um, and as anybody who has lost anyone or just had an immense tragedy and has to face that, there are a lot of difficult conversations. And even though I'm an adult, when your parent passes, you're also a child still. You have that inner child.
Absolutely.
And so all of these conversations you have, it's not as simple as I'm the adult in the room because you're either talking to your other parent or your siblings or, it's complicated. And so then I was like, I really want to dive deeper into this. How do I do that? And I started interviewing people that I respect and know who have gone through tough situations. And we all have had difficult conversations. They're going to happen in life. And so I reached out to people that I know are really good at it, like you and many other leaders I know, and just asked, what was the most difficult conversation and how'd you go about it? And I'm very fortunate that a lot of people said yes and shared their story. Um, because I think the more we share our stories, the more connected we are. We don't feel so alone. And I found when I was speaking about my mother passing and dealing with relationships after that, the people who made the biggest difference were the ones that I spoke with who could share similar experiences and lessons learned. And so I'm hoping this book with all of these stories will give a window, maybe before someone has to have that conversation, to help them prepare. And if it's after, maybe they'll learn something from the conversation in the book as well. So that's why I wrote it. It's really about being authentic, and that if we don't have these difficult conversations, we can't actually be ourselves because we're keeping it trapped in or locked up. And that doesn't do anybody any good. And it's actually pretty unhealthy.
I can relate to all of what you said. I mean, and I think most people will feel the same way. I hope everybody gets a chance to grab the book and read through it because I've had the benefit, as you know, of reading an early copy and participating in the process. But I just am struck by how common the challenges are, but also how many people just don't dive in and explore like you did. So thank you for doing the work and bringing that into the world for the rest of us. So again, I'll put on my curiosity cap. I know there are a lot of different topics you covered in the book. I particularly, as a leadership coach, spent a lot of time working with leaders. So I'm curious, what were the biggest challenges that popped up with conversations with leaders that you spoke to?
So the two um, stories that came out, there's a little bit of echo. Hopefully we can fix that. The two stories that came out were, one was around, you have an employee who comes to you. They're really not doing well. They're miserable. You do want to coach them. However, maybe they aren't a good fit. And so how do you help the employee come to the best decision for them, whichever it is, without, just telling them you're doing terrible, we're firing you, because that's not a good conversation. And that's not delivered well either, right? How do you really seek to understand, well, what is going on with this person? What is the challenge? And so Mike Mcnulty is one of the people that I interview around that topic, and that's the story he shared. And it's a really great story because sometimes a conversation isn't about, most of the times, it's not about telling someone something. It's about listening and asking questions and helping them tease out their own answer. And so that was a really fabulous one, and he is masterful at that. And I think, as leaders, it's not manipulating it or even influence to some degree. It's really just letting someone be themselves and come forward and share what they're thinking and giving them space to do so. The second one was with a very good friend of mine, Mark Watson, who shared what it was like saying he'd made a mistake. And, he had hired someone and brought them in, and just what happened in that situation and what he needed to realize and his ownership in it. And I think that's huge. So many leaders today, and people in general, but definitely leaders, either don't want to be vulnerable, don't want to admit they did something wrong, or are afraid of what that might mean for the relationships they have. But in reality, we're all human. We all make mistakes. And so it's quite refreshing to have a leader just come forward and say, gosh, I messed up. And by the way, most people know if you messed up. So it's not like if you keep it a secret, it's actually a secret. And so those two interviews were really fun and just very different lenses about giving people space, but also taking accountability as a leader and not being afraid to have those conversations.
Makes a lot of sense. And I think, the leaders that I coach across the board, men and women, experienced, not experienced, everybody can relate to those stories as well. And, I think there's other topics too that leaders need to explore. So it's neat. Maybe that's in the next version of your book.
I've already got like 30 interviews that I know would be more conversations to add in. But Dan, I know you as a coach, you coach people all the time on difficult conversations. And this year has been especially difficult. And which is why I'm glad the book is coming out, because we all need to practice this, especially now. But what are some of the things or conversations that leaders have come to you with, challenging and exciting, right? Not everything this year was bad. There's a lot of good things that happened. There are a lot of challenging things. So what have you seen? And if you could share a couple of examples, that would be fabulous.
Yeah, I'd love to do that. And it really covers across the board, right? We are in conversation with people almost all day long, every day in some form or fashion. So I'd say on the more challenging side, with a little bit of the negative, conflict avoidance, which is a lot of what your book is about, a lot of leaders don't want to give the feedback, as you were describing, about they're not cutting it, or peer-to-peer challenges are so common and people are so nervous about giving, if they call it feedback, but it's really just communicating and having a conversation to say, to keep it simplistic, you've let me down. Somehow you broke a promise you made to me, whatever that was, about get me the deliverable by 5 p.m. On what planet? 5 p.m. when it's 3 days later. It could be that simple, or it's help me understand why you cut me off in that meeting and you didn't let me finish, or you took the idea and ran with it as if it was your own and never attributed back to the leader or the leader's team. And there's a lot of missing conversations. They'll talk to me about it in a coaching session, and I can hear all the frustration and all the emotions, and we try to pause and say, what's really coming up for you? But a lot of times we boil it down, it's often very simple, but it's a missing conversation. And when we can boil it down and say, if you could say one thing to that person that they could really hear and kind of cut through all of the noise, what's the one thing? And I'll be honest, Jen, depending on who the person is and the time of day, sometimes they can't come up with that. There's 45 grievances they have And then the conversation's about, well, maybe not today. Today may not be the day for whatever conversation, whether orally or in writing. Let's just take a pause and get your thoughts together. But more often than not, it's what's the one thing? And if you could say it, then what would be different? What would you hope that they would do? How would they feel? How would you feel after you shared it in whatever manner you choose to? So without going into any more details, I know that's somewhat generic, but that's more of I see that all the time. It's the small stuff. And as your book talks about, if we don't address the small stuff authentically, it becomes the big stuff and becomes a barrier that makes no sense at all, usually. When we're on the other side of it, we look back like, why would we make that so hard? What thoughts are for you as I share that? I mean, did you come across that in your work?
Absolutely. One of the books that I there's so many books on communications, crucial conversations, impossible conversations, difficult conversations. But one of the books I read was, let's talk about the elephant in the room. And I love the story the author shares because he says, when a conversation starts, it's a little baby elephant. It can come in the door and it can go out the door and you can get rid of it. But the longer you put it off and the bigger the elephant gets, it's really hard to get rid of and it takes up the whole room, right? And so it's one of those things where the example you gave, if you're in a meeting and someone cuts you off, it's better just to go talk with them. You don't have to call it feedback. I feel like sometimes feedback automatically sounds like it's going to be negative. Like, let me give you some feedback. And it's like, no, 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 no. I don't want to get any feedback. And sometimes it's just a misunderstanding. But to your point, one of the crazy sort of statistics I found in my research, 1 in 4 people have been putting off an uncomfortable conversation for at least 6 months. And 1 in 10 people have been staying silent on an awkward issue for more than 2 years.
Wow, that's crazy.
Like, I can't even imagine. If I don't do the dishes, I feel guilty and I'll do them the same day. I can't imagine holding off on a difficult conversation for 2 years, right? That's a really long time to be carrying around something which maybe could actually be pretty easily resolved.
Yeah, definitely. And that's usually what we see. And again, your book offers so many tips for people on various topics that if they're uncomfortable with it, I think that they could read the book and get some really wonderful ways of, all right, who cares? It's been 6 months, 2 years, 5 years. It's never too late until someone's gone and we can't have that conversation. And I hate to say it that way. But other than that, really, guess what? It can happen today if we choose to. But we're not going to fix 5 years of silence in one conversation, which I also think people need to remember. It's typically what's a series of conversations, but what do you want to get across today? And sometimes what we want to get across, I think, is to create the space, as you said, to let the other person speak and share their perspective. I don't think we do that enough.
Well, just because you're listening doesn't mean you agree. Just because you're listening doesn't mean you don't get a chance to speak. It just becomes it's really out of respect that you're having other people share their truth. You may see a conversation from one perspective, your own, and it for you might be a truth. But until we listen to, well, what is going through this other person's mind? Where are they at? What are they thinking? What have they experienced? What are they concerned about? We just don't have enough information. So I think communication is less, it should never be about someone needs to win, someone needs to lose. It should be about how can I learn more, listen more, and then figure out how do we move forward together. And one of the things I've been fortunate enough to attend your workshops and listen to is about, when people are under stress, how they respond or don't respond is very, very different than when they feel like they're in a safe space. And that research definitely came out and came up for me in the book. I'd love to get your perspective on it and how you talk about that with clients too. And what you recommend as, here are some things you can do to manage yourself first and also de-escalate, because you can only control yourself. However, whatever you do can also help, make it a bit easier for your audience, for them to feel safe too.
Yeah, thanks for the question, because I think that a lot of times we're always, when there's conflict or we're uncomfortable, we're thinking about what the other person did or didn't do to us. It's all about them and not about us. And in my coaching, when I'm working with people, I really do try to create the awareness first of, as I alluded to before, what are you feeling? What are all the things you want to say? What are all the emotions you're feeling? And most of those are pretty negative when people start out in this conversation, let's be honest. But it could be the opposite. It could be when somebody's overly excited about a potential opportunity or potential job, or I want to have a broader role or impact, and they don't know how to talk about that either. So it goes both ways, right? When there's a lot of emotions. So one of the things I try to help people do first with their own awareness is pause, take a breath. That's always the first thing. Breathe, just breathe, right? In, not just out. And most of the time when people are really, I'd say they're wired one way or the other, they're forgetting to actually breathe in. There's just a whole lot of exhaling. So that's a simple baby step, right? A tip for everyday use. But I really help them try to say, what do you need to feel safe? What do you need to feel respected? And in the context of conversation, respect is really about, I want to be heard. Most people just want to be heard. They don't expect the other person to agree, believe it or not. Don't tell my husband this. After almost 29 years, I think he thinks I want to win all the time. And sometimes I'll be honest, I might about the dishes or whatever. But in all seriousness, it's more about, how do you want to feel after you've had this conversation? Do you want somebody to do something for you? Or do you want them to stop doing something so that you can do something, right? It's like so basic. It sounds silly with me saying it, but it starts with helping the person raise their own awareness and then taking that awareness and saying, now, what do you think that other person needs to feel safe and to feel respected so that they're willing to actually hear you out, especially if it's you sharing something they may not want to hear or they're just distracted. More often than not, especially this year, you know this well, Jen, we've had a lot of conversations. What a year. Whether work, whether home, people schooling their children, worried about people who are getting sick. The list goes on and on and on, but we're distracted. So that's another piece of conversations that I think gets all bundled up is we make assumptions about why that person didn't hear me. I did it all right, Jen. I asked the right question. I was patient. I listened, and they still don't hear me. They don't get it. And so I'm just going to pause there and say, I think that's a big piece of kind of granting each other a little positive intent and give yourself a little break as well. And again, just take a breath. So I'm curious about your thoughts as I've shared that. Is anything coming up for you, or did you come across that in your research?
Well, I think that both of us come from a corporate background. And one of the values that was taught that really resonated with me that I still speak to this day is don't assume someone has a negative intent, right? So as you said, assume positive intent. When we go into a conversation and we have a lot of great stories in our head. We've made up really good stories about this is why we're here. This is, they did this, they don't like me, they're mad at me, whatever it is. This could go terribly wrong. And we're way more melodramatic often than the conversation itself, which is why I think people avoid them because they've got this fantastic Lord of the Rings trilogy battle scenes. And, it's like, just hold your horses a little bit. Let's step back. Um, and so what I tend to ask folks to do, and I think you do this as well, is just walk through some scenarios, right? What's the best case? The best case is they might go, "Oh my gosh, I totally meant to tell you. I didn't mean to cut you off. I'm so sorry. I've totally forgot. Thank you so much for reminding me. I really didn't mean to do that." And then you're like, "Oh my gosh, that was no big deal." A second version of that that's a little more complicated might need you to think through, well, what would you say? If you know what your triggers are, if you work with someone long enough and you know that if they say this or if they say that, you're going to get angry. I think it's helpful as leaders to know those triggers so we can take a deep breath and be ready for that. Because as soon as our brain escalates and starts to be in survival, fight, or flight, it can't collaborate and it can't create a solution either. And so if either party in the conversation has sort of gone off into the I'm in a fight and I need to survive this fight, that's why we need to make sure everybody feels safe, feels calm, so that you can collaborate and find a solution. And I think this year, what was fascinating, I loved having, I don't love that we're in a pandemic. I loved that everyone had to move to virtual because it was a really good forcing function for people to think about how are they communicating and to really make it extremely evident that people are human. Like you're home, you've got your kids that are now in your office because your office is at home. You've got your dogs, you've got your, you've got everything, and there's not a lot of barriers. And so I think it reminded people to not have such a facade and to remember your employees, your leaders, we're all just human. You don't know what's happening with them at home and how it's affecting their work. And honestly, most times things don't have anything to do with you if someone's stressed. Um, but again, don't assume, just ask, check in with them, and then go from there. We have enough drama. We don't need to create our own drama.
I think, just to build on that, something you said reminded me of another tip that we often do when in a coaching scenario is not only knowing your own triggers, but anticipating how the person you're speaking to might respond. What might be their potential triggers, their fears, or their worries about whatever the topic is? Now, we're not mind readers. We don't know for sure, but if we have some time and history with these folks, especially using the book, right? There's a lot of personal examples in there that you used, then we can probably take a pretty quick guess at what's going to upset them or worry them. And so the idea there is to think about that and say, if this happens and they get upset, how do I want to be? How do I want to respond in that moment? So that I don't pick up and add to it. Instead, I hold the space. And I know that's a coaching term, so let me explain hold the space, but just pause, not overreact, not be too quick to talk. If they're getting emotional, give them a moment to get emotional and maybe even take that opening and say, wow, that seemed to bring up a lot of emotion for you. Help me understand what it is I said that caused that, because I certainly didn't mean to add on to whatever's concerning you. I know that sounds simple, but it really isn't. Because in meeting somebody and respecting them, it also helps them take a moment to gather their thoughts and decide whether they want to continue the conversation at that point in time
Mhm.
or take a pause and say, you know what, I really think I need to take some time. Maybe we can get together tomorrow or a couple days, or I could call you back later today.
One of the things that I think people forget, and the book is really about difficult conversations with people you care about, people you know, like, and trust. And so it's not strangers on social media, right? I think when people think about conversations, I want to make sure, for example, on social media, oftentimes people post on social media, they don't want a conversation. They just want to put their idea out there, which is why they get mad when someone responds in a way they don't want, because that was a monologue. It was not intended to be a dialogue. They wanted it to be a fabulous monologue that lots of people thought was amazing. And then when we engage in a dialogue, it's like, oh, no, 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 I'm going to name call or whatever. Um, and so these conversations really are about with the people in the relationships you value the most. How do you go about those? Because those are the ones where it's high risk if we don't have them, or if we do and we don't go in prepared and planning. Here's what might happen. One of the chapters is about, two interviews where I interviewed a father who came out to his children, and I interviewed a person about coming out to their family as queer first and then transgender later. Those are really intense conversations because they're about your identity, who you are, the risk the transgender community faces as far as being kicked out of their house, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It is really mind-blowingly scary. And so when I think about for leaders, if you just need to sit down with someone and say, gosh, you know, I'm happy to give you some more time to go around the table so you don't interrupt. Or, gosh, how can I help you be more successful? I know this is one of your goals. What can I do? Those conversations, although hard, they pale in comparison to some of the conversations people have to go through day to day. Um, and so that's part of why I had some of those stories in there too, to just provide perspective and help make us all a little braver, because oftentimes the conversations we face, they're very scary for us in our situation, but it's all relative. For you, let's say you're coaching someone, a leader, or even as we think about the new year, people are going into conversations to ask for things, right? So let's flip the script a little bit. What have you seen, or how have you worked with people this year, or even as they plan into next year? How do you coach people on making some of those challenging asks? Um, can you think of an example that you can share and give us some insights into what you're seeing or how you're coaching people?
Yeah, absolutely. It comes up all the time, to be honest. A lot of times it comes up when people are ready to take on more responsibility, they want a bigger role, or they're already in a really senior role, but they find themselves not all that energized. And the conversation becomes, but what's possible? If you could ask for anything you want to ask for, what would you ask for? And it's really interesting because, put a different spin on this, at first the conversation needs to happen with themselves. They won't even voice it. They won't even write it down. And after a year like 2020, it's been a really interesting thing that for quite a while that just was muted. That whole conversation about future and epic goals and possibilities, it's just kind of like wah wah. But now that the year is winding down in 2021 and a vaccine coming out, the people's optimism is beginning to show up again in my coaching sessions. And there, part of it is, what are you afraid of? What's the worst thing that can happen if you speak that truth into the world? Whether you declare it in a corporate setting to your boss and raise your hand and say, I love what I'm doing. It's been an amazing learning year, but here's where I want to be next year. What are you afraid of? And usually, if they can talk about what they're afraid of, they actually catch themselves of like, just to your point, it's not that relevant. It's just not that big a deal. And then we talk about what's the probability and likelihood of that scenario coming true. And if I can get them to sort of realize that it's their choice if they want to take the risk to have that conversation, that the payoff is much greater as opposed to the cost associated with A, not thinking about it, and B, not having the conversation or two or three. The other place I've seen it come up a lot this year, a lot of people, unfortunately, have either been downsized, laid off, or their jobs have fundamentally changed and they found themselves in the job market. And they're out there like, part of the year, let's say 6 months ago to the last 3 months, oh, there's just not jobs out there for me. I don't see anything advertised that gets me excited. Well, what part of that conversation is, all right, what do you really need versus what is your wish list? But better yet, it's like, how do you network and go have those conversations to go create the opportunity that may or may not actually currently exist as a job description or a job requisition out there? And spend a lot of time talking to people about more of the really interesting stuff out there to do. And whether this is your daytime job or is this a place to be participating in your community or politics or social causes that you're interested in, is we need to speak it into the world, have a series of conversations to help get the energy going, gather the ideas, and turn it into something that almost seems like a no-brainer, whether in a corporate setting or not. So that's where I've seen it the most, in those two scenarios. And, I just think if people are looking forward to the new year, I would challenge them to say, what do you wish you could say? And why aren't you? And what are your fears around it? And if you don't address the fears and push your way through them, what is the cost you're going ahead and accepting? And are you comfortable with that? And usually when you put it that way, nobody's comfortable accepting the cost of not opening their mouth and having a conversation.
When I think about New Year's, since it's almost here, I can't even believe it's December. Um, and that we're already talking about New Year's resolutions. Um, I envision, because there are a lot of things that happened this year that forced us to have more awareness and more difficult conversations. Whether it was, George Floyd, whether it was obviously the election, and I think for leaders or for any of us, and I know for me specifically, I really want to focus um, now and into next year, practicing these more, creating safe spaces where we can pick a small topic and discuss it, and especially with someone where maybe I know they have a different opinion. I am much more patient now for the most part when it comes to difficult conversations. I can, when someone says something, I have a filter now where I can sort of press pause and go, okay, I just didn't understand what they said. It's not that what they said made me mad. I need to ask more questions because the words they used are not the ones I used. So I just need to reconcile, right? And so I think for leaders looking into 2021, empathy and listening and being curious um, are really important. And I also think being brave, right? One of the things I've tried to do normally, if people come to me, would you help me with this? I'm like, oh yes, oh yes. I say yes too much, as many of my friends will tell you. However, I did have a conversation this week where someone came to me and they said, "Could you deliver this message to this group?" And I thought about it and I said, "Well, are they asking me to be the messenger, or is this a conversation I actually should be driving?" And that's another takeaway for me, and I think for anybody in the professional setting, be very mindful when someone's trying to get you to be the messenger versus it's actually the conversation you need to have. Or if you're, by the way, self appointing yourself, like, oh, that's my good friend, I need to go tell them they're doing something that maybe they should change. But if that's not your message to deliver, like make sure you're holding leaders accountable to deliver the right message. I think that's another thing that people forget sometimes is you don't have to have the conversation. It doesn't have to come from you. And although we're talking about getting out and having difficult conversations, they need to be the right ones. We don't need to create difficult ones, right? But the ones that do come to us or that we identify, be very intentional about which ones you're taking on and working through. And I don't know. I'm sure in your coaching space you've seen that, but is that something you think, as far as patience and empathy and choosing the right conversations? Is that something you're seeing as you coach people?
Yeah, I definitely see it. And something came up for me as you were talking, which is just a slight spin off what you said is if we're not having the conversations we should be having, somebody else is having them for us. Or our silence is allowing the story to be told that is rarely, if ever, even remotely based on facts. It's almost always based on assumptions. So there's almost a responsibility to own the conversations when we're in a leadership role that are ours and it's very distinctly different than delegating responsibility. I work with a lot of leaders who need to delegate more and more and more and trust and trust and trust and have two-way conversations so everybody can be honest about what concerns them about that setup. But that's a different topic for a different day. But on this, it's so much about making sure that we're being curious and asking that question back to like, if I can only say one thing, or in this case, as you said, ask the question for the sake of why should I be the one to deliver this message? I think when we ask ourselves for the sake of why am I going to have this conversation, what do I hope that the other person will do, feel, or how will I feel? Those simple questions I ask all the time and teach my clients to ask themselves is you would already catch yourself. For the sake of why am I having this conversation? And the answer is probably, I don't know. If the answer is, I don't know, then guess what? It's probably not yours. Then the question could be, put on the curiosity cap, who else is better suited to have this conversation? Or is it not my responsibility? And I'm actually going to clear some space, give myself permission to focus on the things I need to own. Because I'm sure we all, if we're honest with ourselves, I would take that on consistently year over year as a goal for the year is to own more of what I should be responsible for and learn to say no to some of the other things, not because I want to be rude or irresponsible, is I actually want to create the learning space for somebody else to step up and then to coach and support them if they're scared or they don't know how to do it, which again is where reading your book is such a beautiful place for somebody to start. If they don't know where else to start, and you didn't ask me to say that, I'm just saying it, people, read the book because why not? Something's going to resonate in one of those chapters. We live in a challenging, complex world. We're people, perfectly imperfect people. So we make mistakes every day when we communicate, especially with the ones we love, because we try really hard not to screw it up. And I think when we do that, we often don't get it quite right. So anyway, that's really what came up for me. And I think all leaders, but all people need the empathy and the listening, no matter what context we're operating in.
Well, I think your point about responsibility and what conversations do leaders have a responsibility to have? And when I think about the two stories in the book, that wasn't anyone else's job, right? Like if a leader makes a mistake, they need to come forward and depending on the situation, communicate about it. Because if you're not communicating and you're not owning the narrative, to your point, nature abhors a vacuum. People will come up with stories, they will gossip, they will talk, they will paint it in a way where you don't really have agency to shape it anymore. Which is why even when we think about crisis management, reputation management, depending on the situation, you want to address it quickly. Call a spade because people know it. And the longer you delay, it's actually very expensive to the organization. I'll find one of the statistics in my research. I was blown away. They predicted a cost of what not having conversations is, and it's like hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars, right? And obviously, it depends on the organization and the situation. But I think it's safe to say that it's not free. It's not cheap. It costs a lot. Um, and one of the things that I think is critical in any company in any relationship is trust. If somebody trusts that I have their best interests at heart, even if I kind of have a clunky conversation, but I let them know I really care about you, this is what concerns me. Can we talk about it? That is a very different way to approach a conversation than to say, you did something wrong and you need to change it so that you don't get let go, right? Those are such different messages. One is much more positive. One is much more not intentionally punitive, but to the recipient, it feels really punitive. Um,
There's definitely an art to that part of the communication, right? And the people that you interviewed in your book, you give so many tips that could be really helpful placed if people don't have that language. I also offer workshops and things like that around collaborative communication because I think I've discovered in my work that we were never taught this.
mm,
How do you ask open-ended questions and really come from a place of curiosity and not judgment? I thought I was good at it before and all my background in history, and I had a good career leading up to where I am today, but I was not a good listener. I was listening to interrupt. I was listening to say, "Oh, I have a solution for that." I'm just being honest, right? It wasn't always terrible. I didn't have negative intent, but I have learned, and I'm still a student of this. I will be for the rest of my life to listen, to understand, and then to help the other person feel heard and respected. And that is something I'm committed to and committing to teaching pretty much everybody I interface with, not just my coaching clients, right? Is I think we can all just learn from one another in society. It's not just about leadership, it's about our responsibility just as humans walking this planet with all the challenges we face now in this world, asking one another, help me understand your perspective on that. Oh, that's interesting. Without being snarky about it, it's like, I'm not sure I understand that, or I want to sit with it. Or that's interesting because that's a very different way than I look at this. Now, please don't try to have that conversation on social media. To your point, that's a disaster. It does not work. But one on one over a cup of virtual coffee or a socially distanced 6 feet end of the driveway with your neighbor about all the various topics that we're challenged as a nation and a world, honestly, with, there's so much we can learn from one another. May not solve any one problem, but it's going to help shape our perspective. So that would be my wish for everybody into the new year is that we all put on that curiosity cap, ask those open-ended curious questions and engage in conversation that way because you can't be wrong. You can't.
right. Well, and part of the end of the book, I share a framework for how to think about communications. And one of the reasons is because I realized as I was going through it, and some of this will sound like, of course, you should have already known that, but we all learn in our own ways. Um, what's a goal for a conversation, right? And I've recalibrated. Right? A goal for me in a conversation could be, I just want to listen, and that's a win for me to just listen and be present and not judge. And so it removes the pressure where if you go into a conversation, you say, we need to resolve this. That's a really high pressure goal. If the goal is, I want to get through the conversation listening, asking at least one question and not overreacting, the odds of surviving that conversation for the next one and protecting the relationship go up a lot. So I think recalibrating on, is my goal to listen in this conversation? Is there anything I need to share? Those are pretty, they can be pretty innocuous, but it is definitely a lot easier than saying we need to have all of this figured out by the end of the conversation. Because as you said earlier, conversations, I mean, you could have 10 and still not be done with the conversation, right? You could have 20, it depends if it's family stuff or, because sometimes people usually can only handle one thing in a conversation. So if you do have a list of things to talk about, it's going to take a while. Um, I know we're coming up on Q&A. So for our audience, I would love for you to drop questions in chat. Melissa from Rescue Event Planning has been running all the behind the scenes. So thank you to her for doing that. She'll pop questions up so we can see them. So definitely think through some of those and share them. Um, Diane, we were mentioning New Year's resolutions. One of the other ones that I think is really important, and I'd love for you to pick another one to share, or maybe even a question people can ask themselves to think about. Would love for leaders to think through, given we're in a virtual space right now, and we will be for a while longer, informal communications look very different than they did in the past, right? People need to really think about where are they having those connection points to build trust and build relationships and not always have a formal agenda that kind of makes people feel like they can't let their hair down a little bit and just get to know each other. And in a virtual space, that's tricky because they're not a water cooler conversation. You actually have to schedule it to have it. But I would love, and I know for the networking groups I'm a part of, we have more formal meetings and we have more informal meetings because that blend is so important to continue to know each other, like each other, and build trust. Um, what are some things that you're hoping leaders would do? And then what do you think leaders should ask themselves as they reflect, as they wrap up the end of the year and sort of think about for next year?
Wow, that's like three questions. So I'm going to sit for a second and think. So on one note, as I mentioned before, I would love leaders to think about what is a conversation that I've been avoiding that has a cost to the organization, depending on how senior they are, a cost to my team or a cost to my coworkers. So it doesn't matter where you sit. So that would be one general topic. And how can I give myself permission to have it? And then leverage your book or other tools to go ahead and figure out how to learn how to do that. The other thing I would say personally for leaders is asking the question of how can I grow in this space? So to your point about whether it's networking or deepening relationships or who do I not even know? I just task them all the time. I'm a teller, I'm not a listener. So like picking an area to deepen a relationship through conversations, I think would be really time well spent. So those are the two that come to mind. And I think you asked me a third question, but I forgot it.
What is a question you would want leaders to reflect on
Oh
as
yeah.
they wrap up the end of the year? And then Melissa's going to pop in a question from the audience too.
Why don't
So,
we take the audience question and then I'm
let's
going to
do the
noodle
audience.
on the question. Yeah.
Right. Do you find that men and women approach conversations very differently? And if so, how? Sorry, I didn't mean to laugh like that. I think we all approach conversations how we approach them. Men and women can have differences, right? Um, but they're not all the same. So I don't want to generalize completely because that's not fair. When I think about my husband and I, for example, um, most men are not afraid to say what they need to say and they'll just be direct and communicate it. I think for me, when I'm in a conversation with my husband, it's really more listening for what's he really trying to say and what do I need to ask to understand it more. That's personally at home. I think in the workspace, men speak up differently than women. If you're in a room where there's not a lot of women, I think the communication dynamics change a lot. If there's less than, let's say, 10 to 15% of women in the room, women tend not to really be listened to. You might find men reiterating something if the female said, and then they get credit for it. It's kind of awkward. Um, so I do think there are differences. Don't get me wrong. But I think if we practice communication skills and we're listening to the person we're with and very present, whether they're male or female, that's an important step to take because that will serve you no matter what, whether you're talking with male or female. I think there are differences, but I would say practice having conversations and see how you're reacting and how they're reacting and pay attention to that as well. I mean, Diane, in your experience, what are some of the specifics you've seen?
I agree with everything you said about I would not generalize because I've coached men who are reluctant to speak up. But I can say one thing I'd add is that often women sort of think about the emotions of people in the room and how whatever they'll say or not say might somehow cause somebody else some kind of distress. Where more of the men that I coach don't think that if they're not speaking up, they're not speaking up because they have some kind of fear or concern of how they're going to be perceived as I'm not smart enough or I should have known the answer to the question. Now I recognize I'm generalizing there, but again, all the more reason to check yourself first. What are all the emotions I have around topic X? That takes work. That actually takes some coaching to be able to react in the moment. If there's say a meeting with a whole bunch of people in the room, to your point, men or women. But if you have the opportunity to drive the conversation and choose to speak up or not, I'd go back to kind of what we said. For if you could say one thing and only have your voice be heard one time in this meeting, what was your say and why? And what do you hope will happen as a result? And I think that transcends men or women. We should all kind of work on that, I think.
I think there are times in meetings where, there's a timing question. So, save your question until a little bit later and ask it, for example. Wait for others to speak and then chime in so it's more informed and you're sort of the last one at the top of the mind. Um, but I do think one thing I try to do is I try to find a few people who I know have different ways of communicating from me. And if I'm going to have a conversation or I want to speak up in a meeting or I want to share a perspective, I will run it by them first to say, here's what I think the situation is. Here's what I'm going to say. What do you think? Because when I ask people, my husband's a perfect example. Because he says things so differently, when I ask him what does he think, I get really great feedback. Because I'm like, oh, I didn't think about it coming across that way. Right. And so I think as a leader, it's also good, or any person, to have your own sort of advisory board that you can ping for the really important stuff to get input and feedback to understand if this is how I communicate, what's going to happen. I think if you're a leader whose audience is diverse, it's important to get diverse feedback on how is this going to play? How's it going to come across? Am I going to really screw up if if you've never talked about race and you're getting ready to talk about race because it matters for your company? I would get coaching and talk with people. And right, there's some serious situations where you want real help and coaching. There are some situations where it's okay just to ping people around you and move forward. So I think there's also like, what situations are you needing to lead in? Because sometimes you absolutely want help. Do we have any other questions that we want to pop in?
Can I just add one
Yeah.
thing to that, which is just like pinging somebody or advisory board ahead of time, pinging somebody afterwards that's a trusted person and say, hey, how did that land?
Yes.
What did I miss? What wasn't clear? Better yet, that they ask the question in the room and you build that, between each other so that you offer that to that person, they offer it to you. So again, no matter where you sit in the organization or even in your family, let's be honest. I mean, there's chapters in your book about family, lots of it, right? So maybe one sibling talks to one parent and says one thing and another sibling tries it a different way. And then you compare notes and kind of say, are we on the same page about what we're trying to achieve? But we may not get there. It might take months or years to sort of have that influencing conversation about what might be right for, as in this example, an elderly parent or something. So I also think getting that feedback and making it something you welcome and you say thank you, like really utterly thank you, of like, especially when the feedback is something like, you could have done better. I know you didn't mean it, but here's what I heard. Our initial reaction is going to be, so our brain lights up like, oh my God, I screwed up, right? It's like, no. You can have the thought and then say, what can I learn? And I don't think we have any other questions right now from the audience. So I'll come back to the question you asked me. I have so many forward-looking questions, but just to keep tying to this, I said, what are your What risks are you going to give yourself permission to take in 2021? And why? And those risks, it could be across the board, but in the spirit of conversations, they almost always, the missing ones, we're not having them because we think there's some risks. So, what risks are you going to give yourself permission to take in 2021 and why? Because if you don't even try, you know the status quo is going to continue or something might get worse. It's rarely going to miraculously get better, especially after 2020, right? We could say, like, oh my gosh, can anything else go wrong?
No, no, don't.
So actively kind of anticipating the risks and giving yourself permission, I just think you're going to play a much bigger game. What about you, Jen? What would you say?
I think it's tremendously important to one, be authentic and be yourself. We are all uniquely made. We're not intended to be cookie cutters of leaders, right? As a leader and as a human, one of the most important things, especially for conversations, but definitely in leadership, it's really important that we have all of that diversity. It's important that we've grown up having our own experiences, that we can share that. And it's important that we seek to understand that in other people and appreciate it. I have some people that I have built relationships with that in the beginning, a lot of people are like, why are you even trying to build that relationship? And I ended up in a place where I was really doing some heavy self-reflection around, look, who am I to judge whether they're a good or a bad person? They're just trying to get through life like me. I need to give them grace to be themselves and help them be the best version of themselves. So I would love for leaders to think about, are there people that maybe they have assumptions about they want to give another chance? Are there people that, to your point you said earlier, they just want to get to know better because people are worth it. You never know where the next best idea might come from unless you ask. And so I think the more we learn about each other and realize how human we all are and how much we really do, we have a lot more in common than we do that separates us. Um, I get frustrated when I go on social media, even on LinkedIn, and you're gonna have to pop that question back up because that was a long one. I didn't finish reading that while I was speaking as well. But I get frustrated when people escalate, right? We're so busy as soon as someone says something that we're disagreeing with or afraid of, especially in politics, or even about the article, the Washington Street Journal op-ed on Dr. Biden. We need to be able to de-escalate, depersonalize it a little bit, so we can just listen to each other, explore without judgment, and then move forward to help each other. Because the sum is greater than the parts. We're all in this together. Um, at least I hope we are. So that's my really big ask of like, ask questions without judgment. Just get to learn and know more about your people because that will only lead to better relationships and more trust. And you can do more as an organization if you've got that trust factor, if you've got confidence in the people around you. But you do have to build that. It doesn't just show up. Melissa, there was a question. If you can pop it back up. I love you mentioned feedback because it does come off as a negative tone. Do you give feedback to your peer? Oh, okay. I think delivery is always a challenge. That's where communication ends up tripping us up. And I'll share a thought, and then I'd love for Diane to chime in. Um, when I'm giving feedback, I really like to practice saying it out loud before. And it's similar if someone makes me angry or something. I'll vent outside. I might start with a terrible sentence or a terrible opening statement, but by the time I talk through it, it's 5 or 10 times out loud by myself. I'm in a much better place. And so when I think about negative feedback, I really try to reframe it into what is helpful for them that will help them not feel attacked, and that I'm here to try to support them so that they're open to even hearing it and they don't shut down. Um, so I do think delivery is really important to practice. If somebody is really abrupt or direct in communication, the negative feedback could be, gosh, could you just not be so direct? You're hurting people's feelings. I need you to like not be so direct. That's not really helpful. But if I did something else where I said, gosh, I really love the points you're making, I would love for you to expand on them more and give us a little more context about why this matters to you and how we need to think about it. Because maybe they're giving direct feedback because they are just a type A person who's efficient, but efficient is not always the best communication. We want to also give context to bring people along, you know, along the journey, meet them where they are. So I would really spend some time reframing conversations so that they're thinking about them with the audience in mind in the words that matter to them and in the way that's most helpful to them and useful in their mind, not what you think is necessarily useful, but how do you translate that so that it really resonates with them. Diane, what do you think? How would you coach someone on rethinking, not necessarily, because sometimes you do have to give hard feedback and you can't sugarcoat it, but like, what would you tell someone or a leader who has to work on that?
Well, I agree with everything you said. I mean, I was nodding my head. I think the only thing I would add, especially when it's peer to peer, is I often will ask if they're open to receiving some feedback today. Because it may not be the day they can handle it. It may be the day the dog threw up on the carpet while they were doing something else in an important board meeting or blah, blah, blah. Today's, I just can't hear you. That's also a sign of respect, right? And most times, even if people are having that bad day, if it's coming from a good place and you have some history, they're going to say, of course, yeah, help me, right? Let me do it. The only other thing I'd add is, and you said this, but I'll just be a little more direct about it, is our go-to style is our own style, no matter how we communicate. So we need our own awareness about what that is. And then to your point, we need to think about practicing the message and for the sake of why, what's in it for them. If there's nothing in it for them, guess what? That's not a gift, that feedback. That's just you wanting to sound smart or whatever. But, delivering that feedback in the manner that they can receive it. What is the style? They might need that warm up of context. They might need I heard you talk about this in a prior meeting, that this was really important to you. I would love to share a little feedback for you because I observe sometimes where that's really working well. And once in a while, I think you're stepping in a hornet's nest and I don't think you're seeing it. And I'd love to share so that you could avoid that going forward. It's a lot of words. I wouldn't use that many, but you know what I mean? And that's where you're practicing on how to do it. But that might feel really awkward and weird to a leader who has a direct style or just any person. I just want to say it like it is. I grew up in New York. Well, guess what? When you leave New York and people come in, you can't talk that way, right? It doesn't land nearly as well when you're living in the South where we say, y'all, I have to adjust my style. And that works in the workplace, it works outside. So I agree with everything you said. And I think we just need to, when we think the word feedback, is it a gift or is it not? Be honest before we offer what we think is a gift that might not be.
Well, and I think your point about timing is huge because you, as the giver of feedback, also need to be in the right frame of mind and not have to rush through it and be stressed. And same way thinking about your audience. So this has been so much fun. I could talk for hours about leadership. I love your perspective. You are also someone who communicates about things just in a different way, and it always helps me learn and grow. And I really appreciate that. That is a gift. Um, we do have a winner of a signed copy of my book, and so Kianush, I will reach out via email. Congratulations on winning. What I would say next is, Diane, how do you want people to find you, reach you? How can they reach out? Because you're awesome. Everybody needs to get to know you. So
Oh,
what
thank
do you want
you.
people to do? How can they talk to you?
Yeah, it looks like it's showing up on the screen here. My website, creategreaterimpact.com. You can find me on LinkedIn. I have some free workshops coming up that, oh, by the way, happen to be about conversations, everyday conversations. So there's one next Wednesday at lunchtime and the first Wednesday in January. And it's just a 1 hour to give some tips and tools to go to another layer. If you have a conversation coming up in 2021 and you're not sure how to do it, come on, come to it. We'll actually practically work on it right there, make a little working session for you. So I would love it if you'd visit me on the website and find me on LinkedIn to share your feedback from today. Thanks so much for having me, Jen.
Absolutely. If you are interested in learning about the book, I kept the ebook on sale through today because this was the last author series. So go grab a copy on Amazon. The ebook is 99 cents. It's going to go up tomorrow. And then the print book is $18.99. If you're interested in having me sign it or even signing it as a gift for someone for the holidays, just shoot me an email, Jen Dalton at brandmirror.com. You can also connect with me on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, all the different channels. But this is an important book. It's an important conversation. That's why there are tons of books about it. But again, I hope this perspective, and go read Diane. Her book, her chapter so far has been one of people's favorites. I meant to tell you that live.
That's good to hear.
Yes, because you do such a masterful job of thinking about the audience. And I know a lot of that is from your training and leadership coaching work. But your chapter, the story in that chapter about you speaking with your father, is a masterful piece of how to go about thinking about the other person. And so grab a copy, check out Diane's chapter, check out all the other stories because we were all going to have difficult conversations. It's not going to get, they're not going to go away. Hopefully they get easier and we get better at owning our own emotions and making things better. So thank you for joining us. I really appreciate it. All of the author series have been recorded. They will be available. They are available on YouTube, so you can check them out, and I'll be sharing them on social media as well. This is one of my favorite quotes. It kicks off the first chapter. Reacting in anger or annoyance will not advance one's ability to persuade. Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Huge fan. And that quote, definitely, you see a quote and you're like, yes, that one's for me. That's my favorite one. So thank you, everybody. Have a great rest of the week. Stay safe if you're in the snow. If you're not, I'm jealous. Take care.